Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Considerations and Resources for the Learning Improvement Facilitator. This is the fifth in our series, and we're very excited to have you here with us today. My name is Amber Malinowski, and I'm one of your hosts today from Weave. We have a couple of ways we want to interact with you during the session today, so I'm going to go over just really quickly the webinar control panel in case this is their first time joining us. On the very far left, you can choose how to connect to the audio, either phone or computer. Everybody is muted, but if you need to communicate with us, you have a couple of different options. There is a chat area, and we will be using this for some interaction today. There's also a Q&A area, and I'll be moderating those along with my colleague, Ray. These can be questions about the session, the presentation, or if you're having any struggles that we might be able to help you with the technology. You can also raise your hand when you ask a question. We will also be doing a couple of polls so that we can get to know you better. And if for any reason you need to leave the webinar, that button is on the very far right. Again, we're really excited to have you today. This is our agenda. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ray to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Amber, and welcome everyone to this fifth in a series of 6 webinars on evolving from assessment to learning improvement. The series started back in the early spring, and we have one more after this one, which we'll tell you about near the end, but they've all been so very meaningful and helpful, I think, to all of us in our field. I'd also like to mention at the beginning that this webinar series came about through the collaboration of a number of groups. The Center for Assessment Research Studies at JMU it has been actively involved, as well as the Virginia Assessment Group. The Virginia Assessment Group actually has a journal called Research and Practice in Assessment, and all of these webinars are based on an edition of that journal, in which articles were written by the folks who are presenting for us today and have been presenting during the series. So a shout out to those groups for collaborating with us to bring you this great information. And then just for some quick introductions, and then you've read some things about them also, but we have with us today Dr. Natasha Jankowski, who is the Director of National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, NILOA, as we all know it by. She's been there for about the past 10 years and has most recently served as the director. Natasha brings to our field and to this webinar just a very broad overview and knowledge of what's happening nationally in the work around assessment, particularly in post-secondary education. Speaks often at conferences, and it's just a tremendous resource. So we're glad to have her with us. And along with her is Dr. Kristen Smith, who is the Director of Assessment in the College of Education at University of North Carolina in Greensboro. And Kristen has also been very actively engaged in the assessment community, and again does lots of presentations, is a terrific resource to the field, as well as certainly to her individual institution and the work she's done there, especially taking assessment kind of to a level of thinking about it in terms of strategic planning and economic impact, and just always working on continuous learning improvement initiatives. So we're very, very pleased to have both of them with us today. And with that, I will pause and let them begin.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Ray, and we are delighted to be here with you today remotely as we have our soothing voices come across the airwaves. And we're going to be talking about considerations and resources for the learning improvement facilitator, which comes from a piece that Kristen and I wrote for the journal. I do want to sort of pause to say welcome and hi, and let Kristen and I both mention why we were interested in this work and what sort of why we care basically in this space before we get to know you guys a little better. So hello, I'm Natasha Jankowski, and for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, I'd like to just sort of start with saying we're happy to be a part of the conversation. Anytime that we think about assessment as a scholarship and as a field of study where we really start to engage in our foundational cores, understand the different models that we use, why we go about doing the things that we do. We are very happy to support assessment professionals in the field as we think through those issues. And so when we get into part of our role is to strive to make meaningful change. And what are our roles in that as assessment professionals to really improve learning and engage in this for the reasons that we say that we do? I'm happy to be a part of that and understand how that's playing out on the field, where folks are engaging in that, and what it means for a profession to think about our roles and competencies as a disciplinary group to move forward to support that work. So very happy to be here and happy to consider the future directions of the learning improvement conversations. But Kristen, would you like to welcome and introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks, Natasha. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I wanted to give a quick thank you also to Ray and Amber and the rest of the Weave team who've helped in the preparation of today's webinar. And thank you to everyone in the audience who's joined us today. We appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to engaging with you. I'm particularly excited to be here with y'all today and sharing what we've learned about being a learning improvement facilitator as we've started to engage in this work. Because in my assessment work, I see programs struggling to make sense of data and use it in a meaningful way and be able to tell a convincing story that they really did improve their students' knowledge, skills, or dispositions. And I want to be able to help them with that. Although I have some, assessment skills that can speak to helping them with that, as an assessment professional, I have to step outside of my usual boxes and, nurture some additional skill sets like facilitating difficult conversations or understanding different communication styles, being responsive to vulnerable spaces that this work might need to take place in, and so on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, and, talk more about those types of considerations that come along with being a learning improvement facilitator. So I'm looking forward to sharing with y'all today and learning from y'all as well as we go through. We'll have some points for y'all to do polls and talk to us in the chat boxes so we can learn more from your experiences as well.
Wonderful. And so that we can get to know more about you, we would like to kick us off with a question on who is joining us today. And I know these are not mutually exclusive categories. And so if you're sort of going, oh, I don't know which one to pick, go with the one that you think you spend the vast majority of your time. If you had to introduce yourself to someone and you say, I am a whatever, what might that be? So would you say you're an assessment professional? Is your main role faculty? Are you staff broadly defined in that space? Would you classify yourself as a learning improvement facilitator? And then again, if you're just like, I'm just happy to be here, it's Monday, and I survived the weekend and had a very lovely Mother's Day weekend of things, you have an option to click that as well. So please feel free to pick the option that speaks most to you today.
And I've got the poll launched and just giving everybody a few moments to vote. We've got almost everybody's had a chance. And then I'll share these results with everyone. Okay.
Thanks, Amber.
No problem. All right, here we go. I'm going to share the results. So 73% identified as assessment professionals, 10% faculty, 9% staff, and 9% learning improvement facilitator. I'm sure they're all also happy to be here, but you can only choose one. So.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to everyone, and I'm excited to hear more from the 6 of you that were thinking learning improvement facilitator. It sounds good, and looking forward to it. So I'm going to kick this over to Kristen to talk about learning improvement.
Great, thanks, Natasha. I'm also looking forward to hearing from our fellow learning improvement facilitators. Please chime in the chat boxes as we go. So this is a picture, perhaps, of what demonstrating student learning improvement feels like. But I think it is worth us just taking maybe a brief moment to discuss what we can think of as a working definition or an operational definition of learning improvement, just for the sake of our conversation today, because we are going to be talking about a learning improvement facilitator. And this definition that we talk about today doesn't have to be the end-all be-all definition, but I wanted to at least give us some general parameters so that we're all thinking through this topic from a somewhat similar starting place. So Here, I've shared with you just a couple of definitions for what you might want to have in mind as we go through and we talk about learning improvement and the learning improvement facilitator. You can see here this first one is actually coming from NILOA's transparency framework, and it's basically saying that one way we could conceptualize learning improvement could be the extent to which evidence of student learning, or perhaps we could say evidence of a lack of student learning, is used to identify areas where changes in practices or policies may lead to improvement. Beneath that, you'll see a couple definitions coming from Susky and Walvord. These are from books about learning and assessment that talk about the importance of following up or reassessing student learning after you've taken some action. And then the last definition I'll leave you with is just a little bit more granular, and it talks a little bit more methodologically about learning improvement occurring when we as assessment practitioners or faculty, staff, learning improvement facilitators are able to make a change to a program and then reassess or follow up to determine if that change positively influenced student learning. So now we can move on and dig a little deeper into the specifics of our conversation today, which is going to focus on key aspects of someone who's facilitating learning improvement. Okay, so anyone or any group of people embarking on a learning improvement journey needs to consider various situational factors. Put simply, situational factors can be thought of as variables or factors that influence your environment. As we can see from our cartoon pilots here to the right, they see a mountain goat and they pose a question which probably reveals to you that they're failing to really comprehensively understand the situation that they're currently in. You know, there's a big situational factor hiding behind those clouds. That's most likely a huge mountain range that they're about to collide with. And when you're trying to facilitate a learning improvement initiative, you don't want to have kind of a big blind spot like that. You don't want to be, you know, in this type of a situation. You want to be aware of, and you really want to consider a lot of different situational factors. So now you might be thinking, you know, what are some situational factors that you want to consider? And what would be an example of a situational factor? So in addition to being variables that influence one's environment, you can also think about these as involving group dynamics, organizational nuances, or even interpersonal communication. These are things that Fink describes actually as a first step in course design, is stepping back and thinking through situational factors within your classroom. Some other examples include organizational culture, leadership, and faculty. And, you know, a lot of these things aren't explicitly in the assessment cycles that we talk about or we use. So they're not necessarily things that we're giving explicit attention to. I'll give you a couple more specific examples of what situational factors could include. So for instance, you know, an organizational cultural situational factor could include things like the environment or mission. It could include subcultures within faculty and students. Another example of a organizational cultural factor could be pressing factors within the unit or department, like budgetary considerations. Maybe you're dealing with a new student population or some external mandates that could divert your attention away from your learning improvement project, or maybe even towards your learning improvement project. This could also be the existence of philosophical or disciplinary fissures or differences within a department. And that could be a key situational factor that you'd want to be aware of and have strategies to address. Some other examples include leadership situational factors. I think one obvious one could be the extent to which the leadership in your department or program is supportive of the learning improvement project. Another could be maybe differences in leadership styles and having to figure out the best way to interact with different types of leaders. Also, a leadership situational factor could be whether there's a leader embedded within the program, maybe a faculty leader that is already organically there that you want to make sure you're working with on your learning improvement project. As one last example, we can talk through a couple faculty situational factors, and I'm sure y'all have a lot more examples of these, but just to give you a flavor for this, something that would be a faculty situational factor could include having a faculty champion, which could be a really critical piece to a successful learning improvement project. This is someone who can be a really valuable point of contact for helping move the project along within a unit or organization or department. You also have to think through some situational factors around faculty members and adjuncts, teaching assistants that might not necessarily be serving in leadership roles, but they're going to be a big part and a big contribution to your learning improvement project. This is definitely not a comprehensive explanation of all possible situational factors, but we just wanted to give you a few examples to get a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about situational factors. Now that you've heard...
Great. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, sorry, Natasha. We're just gonna hear from y'all in the chat box. We've given you some examples of situational factors, and we wanted to hear from y'all about situational factors you've encountered when engaging in a learning improvement project. So if you're willing and able, you should be able to enter in the chat box examples, and Natasha and I will go through them as you're able to enter them.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to it, thank you, Kristen, that you can even think about this if you're like, well, I'm not really doing a specific, something you would classify as a learning improvement project. Think about in your just day-to-day assessment efforts in trying to move this work forward. And I think some of the situational factors that we hear about a lot from assessment professionals is the just various initiatives that are unfolding on a campus. And trying to make what they're doing a priority that falls within it, if it's not sort of accreditation time or a reporting moment at that it sort of falls off the issue. So language issues is another one that we hear when you're having a conversation with a different department. There's disciplinary ways of speaking, and it's sort of a different dialect. And so are you understanding each other? How can you communicate effectively to understand the same aims? And another one that we hear quite often too is just differences in perceptions of assessment, what it even means, what we're trying to do, and how to go forward with that. So what's our history as an institution, and how does that fit into what folks are trying to do in that space? So that's my buying you time to start writing some things in chat, but also share with you some of the things that we've heard from folks that are situational factors. So let's see. Yeah, these are good. Thank you so much for sharing. So we've got some specialized accreditation requirements for certain programs. So the sort of rules and regulations that we are bound by and things that people are trying to do can be an area of either strength or weakness, a barrier or an impasse of sorts, thinking about leadership changes, how and when to bring in student voices to a conversation, and if you're with a group that finds that to be of value, or if that's not an understanding on why student input would be important or a part of that. Faculty engagement, really trying to understand how they are involved and in what ways, and how does this relate to academic freedom, I think is a great one. If you have an academic freedom question, just to throw out a resource, we have an occasional paper on the NALOA website that was written by a scholar of academic freedom. He's a historian, Timothy Rees-Kane, that looks at the relationship between academic freedom and assessment. And I think it's a really nice resource to have in your back pocket if you're going into that conversation. Department size, yes. If you have one person that's doing all the things, trying to get others involved, I think the role of adjuncts in these conversations becomes another space to think about, and what is that faculty culture of governance, and who gets to say and who doesn't. The waiting to see a pilot, did this work, is it worth my time? All of those things are great. Kristen, any that you see you want to comment on?
Yeah, I just saw a few about turnover and leadership change. That was kind of a theme coming across a few, which is definitely a serious situational factor to consider. And when we get into resources, I think we'll touch a little bit on some resources that could help with getting buy-in from leadership and dealing with some of that change and turnover, including having an RFP type of process. I saw a couple too about lack of student involvement. And I know Charlie Blake and Kathy Wise have done some work around bringing students into the assessment conversation and helping them to have a more active role. So that might be a good resource for folks trying to figure out how to better involve students in the student learning project.
Definitely. I just saw one more that I wanted to comment in before we move forward, but please feel free to keep adding your points or respond to each other. It's a chat for all. I do think there is a heightened possibility for faculty fear or mistrust in learning improvement as it relates to, is this going to be used against me if I'm not improving at a certain rate, if we don't see a change that happens? Where is this information going to go and what's going to be used for it? Are there stakes involved? And so I think being very clear on what this is and what it isn't, and all of those pieces will be very important to having buy-in with faculty in those conversations. But thank you all for sharing. Please do continue to share as we go. I am going to talk a little bit about why does this conversation even matter in our current context, and sort of why do we care about thinking about learning improvement and situational factors that impact our work and our ability to move forward. Because I do think it lines up with conversations that we've been having in assessment around, this is not just a reporting issue or getting people to complete reports, and it's not potentially just a professional development issue around how do we prepare faculty to feel comfortable to engage in relation to measuring student learning. So thinking about this as a measuring piece, but that really, when you think about a learning improvement and a facilitator of that, what you're talking about is inciting change and meaningful change in that space, which is a bit of a different role than we've had for assessment folks in the past. So there are current conversations that have been unfolding on, what are the competencies that you need to really be an assessment professional? And if you look at the job descriptions of what we're asking people to do or to engage in this, there's not so much the ability to navigate the situational factors that Kristen was talking about, and thinking about how do we politically navigate an institution or a governance structure. How do you go about making compelling arguments to the various stakeholders, whether it's faculty or staff or students or a new leader, that this is worth their time and how it fits into the larger mission and goals of an institution. And in that space, when you think about really being able to facilitate and keep an eye on learning improvement as what we're going for in here, what we're asking our assessment professionals to do is quite a lot, and in that space, and Kristen will talk later about if who can be a learning improvement facilitator and what that might entail. But I think it does raise roles of, if what we want to do in assessment is improve learning, what do we need to know and be able to do to help us get there? So what are those competencies of assessment professionals that unfold? And there's been surveys that have been done, some reports that came out on thinking about competencies in this space that start to get into some of these more amorphous areas of organizational change and movement. If you haven't looked at the ACPA NASPA professional competencies rubrics, it's been on a side conversation, but I think there's some very nice informational pieces that can be pulled in as we think about what are these roles, what do we need to be able to know and do to improve learning and really facilitate others in going through that process of looking meaningfully at their own practice and their learning in advance in that way. So basically, if we think about a learning improvement facilitator, to really get to that learning improvement, we need to rethink the role of our assessment professionals as a change process. And if we aren't satisfied with the amount of change that we're seeing, or that what we're doing is really getting to a space that it improves student learning, I mean, you can think about the amount of times in the field we get asked the question, if assessment is about improving student learning, show me. Did it actually do that? And we know that assessing on its own won't, right? You're just looking at where someone is on it. But deciding what to change, deciding how to go about making that change, implementing that, and then seeing what came out of it, is really where you start to have the rubber hit the road, and we can now start to make the case about the role of this in a larger educational design conversation. So if we really want to help people improve, we need to be able to understand what to change and how to do it within the structures and the organizations that we exist in and work within. And if we don't know how to navigate that space, we can have a lot of great ideas, but we're not going to see traction or movement on the ground. Within that, we also need to think about the many different people that we need to partner with that have different roles to play. There are places where an assessment professional coming in and speaking in front of faculty governance, for instance, is not going to be the most compelling voice that will be heard in that space. So how do we find our faculty champions? How do we think strategically about enabling our environment with partnerships around centers for teaching and learning, for professional development in those spaces, to help us mobilize to get to where we can actually improve learning? What's the role of students in thinking about that? Because to really facilitate this, you're thinking about this in a much more networked way, because we can't do it alone. And one person probably isn't going to have the entirety of a skill set to get it done, but we can think about our assessment professionals as uniquely positioned to be this network of connecting function that serves as a partner and a hub. Where we sit, you can see across an institution in a way that others potentially can't. And you can make connections between programs or interested faculty that are trying to engage in learning improvement to learn from each other and raise that up and elevate that work. And also, when we think about what we want to change and who our students are, as assessment professionals, we have a different understanding and perspective of that because of our view in terms of institution level data, programmatic data in that space, to embark on a series of conversations that can help move us towards the type of improvement we want to see, without telling people what to do, but really thinking about that in that facilitator role. How are we not the sage on the stage, but the guide along the side as we help faculty think through the questions that they have and the mechanisms to move forward in that space. So when we think about that, that's a lot, but again, it doesn't have to be one person. You can have a learning improvement facilitator that can be a team. You can think about partnering across an institution to bring folks together into this. So what I'd like to ask now is invite you back into the chat and say, you know, what are other ideas that you might have on thinking about taking time to really understand our situational factors and think about what our skill set is needed to navigate around that, or who we might partner with to get what we're trying to do done at the end of the day. So you can share places that you currently partner or would like to partner. If you have any examples of that, if you've got a success story that you want to share, really understanding your environment and the change process within it to get something moving. If you just have some ideas that have been triggered from this conversation or have sparked in your mind about why is it worth taking a look at the situational factors in faculty leadership and organization and culture and all of those pieces in relation to our work, is that worth our time in the field of assessment, and what value can that bring? So take a few moments.
Natasha,
Yeah.
can I interrupt for just a second, just to tell the attendees, in the box where you're doing the chat, it says for many of you to all panelists. If you click that drop-down menu, you actually get the option of doing all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see, if you'd like everyone to see what you're writing. Thanks.
Nice. Yes, thank you. Yes, I love the point on high-level administrative buy-in. Consistent messaging is incredibly important. I think if we are saying one thing as a learning improvement facilitator, or even as an assessment professional in this space, but the message that people are hearing from high-level administration is dissonant in there, then we're at an impasse in there. So thinking about, is part of our role in the situational factors providing people with the messaging and thinking about the communication channels that we move through and how people learn about, hear about, and are supported in why we do this work. What's the value and the purpose within my own institution to engage in meaningful program improvement? Oh. We have someone with their office that's in the Center for Teaching and Learning, which is great. There is one place that their office is with the Center for Teaching and Learning, and it's housed in the library. So they were like, it's like Switzerland on the campus in this nice safe space. I love that. also like the thinking about that these are conversations that if it's really thinking about learning improvement and change, it's not the only time we talk about it is when we're reviewing something to submit our report, that they are conversations that need to unfold throughout the year. And it really also raises up the knowledge that faculty have of the changes that they're making within their teaching practice of, I can tell students just aren't getting it, but what would I change to help them understand and think about it? So having it as a dialogue within the program would be wonderful. Kristen, any that you want to comment on?
Well, I second the comment about the Teaching and Learning Center and using that as a resource and a collaborative partner. I think that's great. And also making it a year-long discussion, threading it more into your culture as opposed to saving it for when, accreditation is coming around. I think living and working in a school of education, we're lucky that our specialized accreditor is actually moving more towards that type of conversation around data quality and making sure we can show we have a continuous improvement process. So that's made it a little bit easier for us to talk to our faculty about, this is a process, it's something we want you to engage in long-term and frequently, as opposed to just when our reports are due.
Yeah. I echo that. I love the idea of this question-driven. If we have a youth problem, if we didn't ask a question and we were just collecting data to collect data at the end, no one should be surprised we didn't use it for something because we didn't know what we wanted it for in the first place. So thinking about what are those questions that we drive in our work. I also think that being aware or helping administration understand the relationship between learning improvement and accreditation, and that to have accreditation be a driver of this in terms of how it's framed as the reason for doing it versus thinking about really understanding what works for our students in what ways and how do we improve their learning as they're coming through is a very different type of conversation. And so when you think about that communication piece, how are we being supported in communicating the value and positionality of assessment as it relates to accreditation is definitely a big one that can make or break all sorts of lovely conversations that we would like to be having. So just to sort of wrap up that part, and do please keep adding in the chat. We will keep coming back to you guys, so you're fine. Really what we're thinking about here is that to engage in meaningful change, because we know that change is happening and meaningful change is happening within our institutions, and it's happening in pockets or potentially in boutique programs for specific types of students, or going on a course by course, or it's by happenstance that we find the right thing to change at that moment that works. How do we make sure that if there are these learning outcomes and goals that we want for our students, that it's not just for some students, that it's not by happenstance, but that it's by design that you get there? And how can we make it where your learning experience is not an island, but it's integrated into something else, and then our programs are also a part of that as well? So thinking about who can facilitate that larger connected nature, to really think about this across for our students so that we can get to the learning that we want to see, and that we know where we are in our process of achieving that, and really thinking meaningfully about that entire change process, not as a standalone entity, but as one that's connected within the organization and the structure that it exists within.
Okay, so at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, clearly a learning improvement facilitator has to be a superhero, right? And, Natasha and I are here to tell you that, no, you don't have to be a superhero necessarily to be a learning improvement facilitator. And I know Natasha mentioned this earlier, that it's not necessarily expected that one individual would have all of these skill sets, all of this social capital, all of this positioning. The learning improvement facilitator is you and me, and everyone here today can be a learning improvement facilitator. So this next segment we're going to use to talk to you just a little bit about what that might look like in terms of perhaps a more concrete skill set. By the way, too, that comic was one of the first appearances of Carol Danvers, which she was Miss Marvel, and then she became Captain Marvel, which might be a superhero that some of y'all are enjoying seeing on the big screen recently. But moving along, we're going to talk a little bit about, more concretely, perhaps in terms of a skill set, what would it look like to be a learning improvement facilitator? As a learning improvement facilitator, you're going to be taking on a learning improvement project that requires you to coordinate across a diverse group of individuals. And this might include folks like faculty within a program, department, or organization, but also other stakeholders and leaders are often getting involved, like department heads or other administrators, maybe some educational developers or faculty developers, maybe even students, alumni, industry experts. And as a learning improvement facilitator, one of your skills would be to coordinate across all these different groups who hopefully are working towards a similar goal of learning improvement. On top of that, you're also going to be asked to facilitate groups in terms of the communication efforts, and that's typically across multiple courses, maybe multiple sections or learning pathways. Each project is probably going to include different stakeholders. So the learning improvement facilitator is kind of entering into these micro cultures within the organization or the unit each time they're engaging in their learning improvement efforts. So being able to lead group facilitation and lead those communication efforts across those micro cultures is a really important skill for a learning improvement facilitator to have. Learning improvement facilitators are usually pretty change-oriented. This idea of seeking change and trying to create strategies that will allow you to actually implement change. You might think of it as kind of a change agent, just someone who is really trying to help implement changes and has the skill to be able to constantly be seeking that change and creating pathways for that change to exist. Now, as Natasha mentioned before, keep in mind a learning improvement facilitator may or may not have expertise, in assessment and educational development or faculty development all at once. But the key thing to remember here is that whoever is a learning improvement facilitator really needs to be willing to partner with colleagues and collaborate with folks who do have these different kinds of skills. So you don't have to be a superhero totally by yourself. And if you don't see all of these skills just within yourself or within one person at your organization or institution, that's okay. Just be willing to partner with colleagues who can help bring those skills to the table. For our next poll question, we're curious to hear from y'all about what your comfort level is with a learning improvement project. Do you feel like you are, that superhero that has all of those skills and, you are currently doing a learning improvement project and you feel great? Maybe you feel like you're trying, but it's a little harder than you anticipated that it would be. Or maybe you're in a boat where you think you want to try one, but you need some additional resources or expertise before you start. Or you might be in the category where you're not even there yet, which is also okay. We're just looking to hear from you about what your comfort level is with a learning improvement project.
So I've got that poll up now, and I'm going to give people a few more moments, though, to click which one is them. Just a few more minutes. Want to make sure everybody has a chance. Okay, I think we're getting close. All right, I'm going to close the poll. So 15% said that they're currently doing one and feel great. 42% said I'm trying, but it's harder than I expected. 25% said, I think we can try one, but I need additional resources or expertise. And 18% said, I'm not there yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Before we jump into, well, I'll actually go ahead, move into this. So there were a couple things that I saw that popped up in the chat that I wanted to comment on, but we're coming back to the chat. So while I comment on those, if you would like to share any examples from your work or experiences that relate about what you are doing or where you're struggling, where you would like some assistance, what you're unsure about, please feel free to put any of those in, and Kristen and I can talk about that. And we're going to move into sharing some resources for thinking about this work and being a learning improvement facilitator in just a moment. But there are a couple of things that popped up that I thought were worth pulling on a bit. And one was thinking about the relationship between Centers for Teaching and Learning and assessment. So on the one hand, it's really easy for us to say, oh my goodness, partner with your Centers for Teaching and Learning, they're great. And if you can work together, that's wonderful. But there is a history there of a wariness on the part of Centers for Teaching and Learning to be associated with assessment in relation to its sort of compliance and reporting mechanisms. And there's a couple of reasons for that we see across the field. One is that most Center for Teaching and Learning efforts focused on individual courses or individual faculty members that wanted to improve their teaching practice. So the focus was really on, I'm trying to implement something in my course, or I want to engage in these different types of approaches. I'm going to go to the Center for Teaching and Learning to help me with that, or teaching excellence, or whatever that entity might be called. Thinking about a program view was then sort of the purview of assessment. How do these things all add up? And the evaluation function, I'm doing little air quotes around evaluation, but you can't see me, so I'll have to tell you about it, became this division point of the centers not wanting to be associated with that it was about the willing faculty who wanted to come to think about improving their practice, they would work with individually. But anything that got into how do these things fit together into a program, how does that relate in terms of assessing or potentially program review type sounding things, was more of a disconnect and an unease. I think as you see a understanding of assessment coming back into a process of educational design, instructional design, thinking about the role of assessment in informing my teaching practice, you see a willingness to engage. But if you're thinking about that learning improvement facilitation skill set required, it's sitting down and having that conversation with the Center for Teaching and Learning folks on where are they comfortable connecting, where are they not, what's the language that they're okay, does it need to be an assessment event, or is that not something that they're interested in doing? Does it need to start with some shared sort of brown bags and posters of faculty sharing their work on a project they did where they collected assessment data to start to build a comfort factor in this space? Relationship building does not happen overnight. So thinking about understanding why there was a disconnect within that specific institution in the past, and what are the ways to talk about it and frame where you're comfortable partnering moving forward, but also using it as an opportunity to educate on some of those perceptions or misperceptions around assessment, what it is and what it isn't, and what each one is about, because they can be a partner in advocating to faculty about the value of this work and connections with Scholarship for Teaching and Learning, for instance, but it requires sitting down and having that dialogue and conversation in really meaningful ways. The other one that popped up that I really wanted to take a moment on was the policy implications, and actually taking a look at what are institutional policies that help or hinder this, but keeping it student focused. So what are the policies that make this harder for students in that space? I think we get caught up a lot of times in understanding assessment procedures and processes and missing the larger argument we can make about how our students experience the flow and movement through our institutions, our programs, and their learning experiences, and the role of policy in having that larger conversation. And the more that we can bring it about students and their learning and less about an assessment process or procedure per se, the more willing people will be to partner and engage and think us through that. So I saw those two, and I'm sorry to sort of go off on a tangent, but I thought those were very worth taking a moment to comment on. So Kristen, I will pass to you for anything you want to talk about in that space.
Thank you, Natasha. I also had two comments that I wanted to circle back around to as well. The first was the comment about asking good questions about student learning making a difference. I think that's so important, and I'm so glad that someone included that in the chat box, because that's something we're trying out here at my institution too, is putting it in the faculty's hands and allowing them to ask research questions about student learning. We're taking kind of an action research approach. So really putting faculty back in the driver's seat, asking them to come up, look at their data and just articulate research questions that they have about improving their students' learning. And I think that's helped them buy into the process a bit more. All of our faculty, most of them do research, so they really get it when we put it in that frame. So I just wanted to highlight that comment and encourage other folks to think about posing this work in terms of questions or research questions about student learning. The other one I just wanted to briefly touch on, I know we don't have enough time. We could talk about this question literally all day, and I know folks have important work to get onto, but I appreciate the person who brought up this question about, I believe it was, how can we divorce assessment for learning improvement from accreditation? And I really appreciate the question, and I just wanted to throw out one idea that we've been using here, just as some food for thought. We actually, I think, are actively trying to not divorce the two. And obviously there can be a lot of tension between assessment for accreditors and assessment for learning improvement. But rather than having those things be divisive, we are trying to have them be more dovetailing. So our specialized accreditor is really focused on data quality and having a quality assurance system and having processes for improvement. So we are trying to leverage that to help faculty really dig in and focus on student learning improvement projects, and talking to them as though, if you're focused on the student learning improvement project and we have this improvement process in place, that's going to satisfy what our specialized accreditor is looking for anyway. So we're really trying to bring those conversations in more of a collaborative place as much as we can. And I think that is honoring the spirit, at least for our specialized accreditor, that's honoring the spirit of what they are trying to do, which is continuous improvement.
There was a couple questions that I saw that popped up in terms of some resources. There's also a shout out that the teacher education programs are a good place to partner because they are training people to do this kind of work. But there was one that was asking about universities and IRB constraints in that space. And I would point you to a viewpoint that was written by Curtis Nazer. And there's also been some really nice discussions on this on the Assess listserv. So if you go into the archive and search, you can find that. But I would definitely take a look at what assessment personnel needs to know about IRBs, the viewpoint from the NALOA side. I'm also happy to send that link around to folks because it provides a really nice overview of that. In relation to distance, when you have people that are far away to try to have them involved in these things, I think technology can be a great use. Doing some sort of badge that's a digital badge to indicate if you're in this community and providing connector events can help with that. Online program facilitators are also a good place to partner with because they have ideas on how to keep folks connected that are at a wide distance. So thinking about how do we keep our own students engaged, I think there can be some lessons to be learned in that space. But let me dive into giving you some resources with a shout out to Keston, who was sort of leading these learning improvement conversations, that if you think about, that if this is about bringing improved learning, and we have all of these abilities to get reporting processes in place and do all this stuff and look at student data and make these changes to impact lives of our learners and our faculty, that's a ton of power that assessment professionals have. And I know at times people feel that they don't have it, that there's a lot of things that they have to do or forced to do or their hands are tied. But within that space, we do have a lot. And so with that comes a great responsibility to use this wisely and intentionally in those. So as you move into thinking about resources around supporting learning improvement and facilitating that, there's a ton. There are a couple that I think from the conversations that were happening in the chat, and thank you guys again for being such an engaged group and sharing your ideas, is that students can be a really great ally in this space. They can help present arguments, they can do presentations, they can help us make sense of the data we're collecting, they can tell us what's working for them and what isn't. And so thinking about how can we involve students in facilitating these conversations, driving the change, helping us make sense of what to do can be a wonderful opportunity to move in that. There's a ton of work on change management tools that exist out there and group facilitations, approaches to understand group dynamics. I think theories of change have been a space where people really like. Kellogg Foundation has these very nice change models that I think make sense for linear analytical thinkers. I see assessment people sort of feel comfortable with it, where you can map out, you know, why do we think these changes will have the impact and how are we going to look at that? And that can be a way to sit down and have conversations with faculty members. But I think as you facilitate these conversations, relationships are very important, but they need to be sustainable beyond turnover, faculty turnover, leadership turnover. And so planning your processes and your approaches with that lens to being strategic about whom to involve at what times and when, so that it can be sustainable. But what is also our onboarding process for people that come into our institutions and our organizations? How do we frame for them what we're about, what we're doing, what it means to be a learning improvement achiever, potentially you could say, within these institutions, so that they can perpetuate what the work that is unfolding and that we're trying to do. Really thinking about the story, how do we communicate out our successes, what worked, what didn't, how are we thinking also about the situational factors of communication channels? One of the things that we see consistently is faculty membership on campus-wide committees, but and it's assumed that because you are a member there, then you sit on another committee, information is being passed to these other groups. And that assumption does not always hold true. So thinking about how can we actually network out our communication map. Where is communication happening? Where is it not? Where is it being sort of, the message is maybe getting garbled or transformed? And how can we think about how to talk about what a learning improvement project is, what assessment even is, and ensure that that communication process is unfolding in that meaningful way. There's a long-standing body of literature that folks can pull from on culture change within institutions of higher education, and I think any of those are good to move from. NCHEMS also has the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, has some really nice different resources, especially around ways to engage leadership and have them think about their roles in that space. But it really depends on what you're trying to do and where you're at and where your institution is. So sort of step one is, how do things work within the institution that I currently exist in, and what's my sort of first step moving forward to get things going. In the paper, the article that was in the RPA issue on it, there were some specific resources that we mentioned that I just also thought we could put up here. If you are interested in sort of, you know, I need help with facilitation training, how do I really do that? Lynda.com has some nice modules. There are also professional development websites like the Association of College and University Educators. They have really nice articles, blogs that are a good starting point, but you can also go through a sort of training around these that embeds assessment within it as a larger teaching and learning issue. POD, which is the Center for Teaching and Learning folks, the network, they have their own listserv, which is a great resource for thinking about these things and having conversations. But they also have a conference, and there's a lot of facilitation styles, there's a lot of ways to do meaningful engagement. Even the language that they use around how they talk about their work can be, I think, very informative to assessment professionals. Just to be honest, we also need to understand how to deal with conflict and a lot of sort of angry people as we go through and are trying to do this work. So the National Conflict Resolution Center also has some information and workshops that are how do you navigate that terrain and think about that. And then there was a strategy that was put forward in there that to speak to faculty, and especially faculty at R1, if you put out an RFP, even if there's no money attached, that looks like something that people are familiar with in that space. So the more that you can also think about how do you look like, how do you sort of look like, walk like, and talk like a duck for faculty members in that, and to find those that are willing and able and want to be a pilot to prove the points you're trying to make, to be that case, to say, look, this is worth your time. And, you know, it is something that we should be doing. Thinking about that as a mechanism to find folks is also very valuable in there. So I want to sort of give Kristen an opportunity to say if she had anything else, open it up for questions, but I also know that I want to be mindful of time, and Ray has some things to say, so I will pass it over to Kristen. But if anyone has questions or comments, we also take complaints. Feel free to throw it in the chat.
Thanks, Natasha. No, I think we're ready for comments, complaints, areas of improvement.
Yeah, so folks have been really, really good about providing comments and questions. So you can continue to throw questions out either in the Q&A box or in the chat box. I did see, Natasha, someone asked if you could give the reference for the academic freedom article you referenced, and for everyone to know, what we will do after this webinar is over is we will be sending you an email with the recording of the webinar, and if there are other things such as that request, and I'm sure Natasha and Kristen are going to be willing to share with us, we can send you those things.
This was some great interaction in the chat box. I always really enjoy that. I think it's a wonderful way to get to know each other a little bit better, and it took us down some interesting paths for conversations. If there are other questions, you can submit them in the chat or in the Q&A area. It may be that we got to a lot of them. So if you have any of those, feel free to send them now. And there was just, there's one in the chat box. There were just a couple of resources mentioned right before the resources slide, and I can absolutely send those. Either I can send the slides out, or I will make sure that they are on the page with the recording. People are very interested in your references. That's awesome. Any other types of questions? Couple of IR.
I would just add one point, I'm so sorry to jump in, but if you are interested in this topic and this just happens to be your first webinar coming in, this is part of a series and the other ones are available. And so there's resources that are scattered across all of them, and it's a really good conversation from a different angle. So while Kristen and I were really focused on the facilitation piece of this, if you're interested in the learning improvement space, definitely check out the recorded webinars.
And I can actually pull those up as well, just to kind of direct people in that area. So I can go ahead and do that now.
While you're doing that, Amber, just a quick comment also. The question came up, or comments, and Kristen did a good job of addressing it, but this whole notion of the tie between assessment and accreditation and all the other areas that we dabble in. You know, many of you know Mike Johnson, who was retired from SAC-COC as senior vice president. Always started his conversations by saying, you know, if we start with the focus being learning improvement, we really don't have to worry so much about accreditation, because if we're doing really good work with learning improvement, accreditation is just going to fall into place. And I know sometimes you know, that might seem simplistic, but I think in lots of ways it really is true that as you're going out on campus and talking with folks, you know, to begin the conversation about learning improvement rather than assessment or accreditation, and try to get that kind of mindset or that philosophy built into the work that you're doing. Just a quick comment that I would make there.
There is one question that came in that I really like from Julie. We will be posting a job for a new assessment coordinator soon. What is some beginning language that I could use to enhance the position with learning improvement facilitator skill set?
I'm totally muted. I love it. So I'll go first, Kristen, and I would love to hear any ideas that you have. But I think in one of the pieces that I mentioned was an article that Ruth Slotnick and I did on 5 sort of essential roles of assessment professionals. And we looked across job descriptions and as part of that piece. And in the job descriptions, a lot of it was reporting, compliance, and measurement. And right there, I think you're setting yourself up for, you get what you ask for. So if you want somebody that understands facilitation, if you want somebody that you have in the description about partnering across institutions, thinking about the language, is this even sort of a supporting instructional design? Is this an assessment as improvement job description, or assessment as reporting, meeting accreditation standards, even titles that we've seen as a sort of compliance analyst for some. I mean, that sets you up. So you don't want to introduce yourself to someone if you're going into learning improvement conversations like, I'm the compliance analyst and accreditation person here. People will close their doors on you. So thinking about what's the title, where is it housed within the institution? What are those reporting lines? Does it fall under academic affairs? And in what ways? Do you want faculty experience as part of it in terms of the requirements and backgrounds of it? And then how are you wording the responsibilities as lifting up, sharing the work that people are doing, facilitating questions of practice, fostering student success and learning, so that you can connect it to various initiatives and pieces. So sort of thinking about reporting and assessment and accreditation is one piece of many, but it's not the main focus. So I would take a look through the language within it to see where you're leaning in that direction, and have someone that's not familiar with your institution outside of it also take a look at it and say, what do you think this job is about? And the kind of person that we're trying to support into, because that can be incredibly telling for things that we're missing in how we're thinking about it. I know that's sort of amorphous and potentially not helpful, but I love that you're asking that question to begin with.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, Natasha. I think I would say maybe this person, if you're trying to get something closer to a learning improvement facilitator skill set, I think any sort of, faculty development or educational development types of language or skills are helpful. Even potentially someone who has taught before, maybe not even as a faculty line, but someone who has experience with teaching and learning and being in a classroom can have even some of those softer skills that I think can be useful. I think another skill set could be a little bit related to strategic planning, helping folks engage in long-term projects, maybe project management, strategic planning, management types of skills, where folks can, set goals and help a group of people who might not always agree keep moving towards an end goal, and, preventing kind of mission drift, and just someone who can see the big picture and help facilitate folks to get there, which I think comes up for people that do things like project management and strategic planning. Those are kind of the most specific ones I can think of. I think that's a great question, though, and I'm encouraged to hear that you are thinking about posting the job in a way that would be attractive to someone who might be a learning improvement facilitator.
Just very quickly, we've run over, and thank you all for sticking in here with us. Really, really big thanks to Natasha and Kristen for doing a fabulous job. This has been so very, very helpful, and lots of people have stuck in all the way through to the very end because they're so engaged in what you're saying. So a big thanks to the two of you and to all of the people who have attended, but then we'll have Amber take a minute now also to talk.
Yes, thank you both so much. I learned a lot, and I love involving the audience this way. I think it promotes some really interesting discussion. And thank you all for coming, and again, as Ray said, for sticking with us a little bit after the hour here. There is a survey that will come up. It's in a different window usually, so don't be afraid if it takes you to a different window. That really helps us shape our offerings and make sure that we are providing things to you all that you find useful, so we'd really appreciate your feedback on that. Our final webinar in this series will be on the 29th of this month, and it will be, it's titled Example of a Successful Program Improvement Effort. It will be presented by 2 faculty members from JMU, so we're really, really excited about that. I did have up just briefly our resource center, our knowledge center. So if you go to weaveeducation.com, go over to Knowledge Center, and then scroll down here, you'll be able to see, soon this will be the recording of this webinar. You can register for the one at the end of the month. You can register even if you just want to get the recording, that's completely okay. And then down here we have webinars 1 through 4. So you're able to just get in and watch those. We also have webinars on program review, accreditation. We have an Assessment 101 webinar. So all of this is for anybody. So you can come in here and use any of these resources. So feel free to visit this page. While you're here, if you want to know more about Weave, we provide a lot of different types of solutions. We have these free resources for everyone. We also have a software platform that helps with accreditation, assessment, strategic planning, program review, and credentials. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can let us know if you'd like to see a demonstration or if you have questions. Everybody who works here, Ray and myself included, have all used Weave on a campus, and so we're very, very familiar with the challenges of that work. We're also very interested in current events and things that are going on, and being part of webinars and things like this, like we had today, to help you do this work. We absolutely love this community and we really want to be a part of it. So feel free to poke around here. If you want to get more information, just let us know and we'll get back to you just as quick as we can. Again, Natasha and Kristen, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. I can see in the comments that we got lots of nice responses. People had a really good time and learned a lot. So really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And we hope to see all of you at the final webinar at the end of the month. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.